Welcome to this presentation of Santa Barbara's earthquakes, droughts, floods, and shipwrecks through vintage postcards and photographs. In Part 4, we will examine two disasters occurring on the same day in our county. My name is George Sampanis, and I will be your host as we open a window into Santa Barbara's past. September 8th, 1923. The Cuba, originally launched in 1897 as the German SS Koblenz, she was seized by the United States during World War I and renamed the SS Sachem. In 1920, she was purchased by the Pacific Mail Steamship Company and renamed the SS Cuba. The Cuba was used to carry passengers and cargo between San Francisco, Havana, and other South American ports. On her last voyage, the Cuba was en route to San Francisco from Panama after a brief stop in Mazatlan. Working up the coast, she encountered thick fog for 3 days. She had been without the benefit of radio, which was inoperative, lacking spare parts. On the evening of the 7th, Captain Charles J. Holland retired for the night, leaving orders to be awakened if visibility became less than 5 miles, and in no case later than 3 a.m. in order to take soundings, leaving Second Officer John Rochot in command. First Officer Wise arrived in the wheelhouse to take the watch at 4 a.m., where he discovered the visibility had been reduced to less than 4 miles, and there was no sign of the captain. He immediately went to get the captain, who entered the wheelhouse in a hurry, partially dressed. Captain Holland directed an immediate turn to port, westward, and at that very moment, 4:30 a.m., Saturday, September 8th, the Cuba struck a reef off the western coast of San Miguel Island in the Santa Barbara Channel. What is absolutely amazing is how she was able to penetrate through reefs and shoals before grounding. See the box in the far left area. Captain Holland ordered reverse engines, and the Cuba briefly refloated, but was swung around by the heavy seas and ran into a submerged reef, stern first, demolishing the twin propellers. Her lower decks flooded, and she began to list heavily, causing a problem in launching the lifeboats. Despite the heavy seas and fog, all passengers and crew were safely loaded onto the lifeboats through the extraordinary efforts of Captain Holland and First Officer Wise. Captain Holland was the last to leave the ship. If getting the lifeboats and passengers wasn't enough of an ordeal, the captain then piloted a lifeboat through the reefs, shoals, high seas, fog, and belligerent seals and sea lions. After 2 tries, he was able to finally find a narrow foam-swept opening to the beach. After landing some 25 survivors, including 14 women on the beach, and believing it to be too risky and dangerous, he ordered the 3 other lifeboats to head out toward the mainland and seek rescue assistance. Lifeboat 1, commanded by Chief Engineer Owens, carrying 22 survivors, Lifeboat 2, commanded by Second Officer Rochot, carrying 24 passengers, and the third by Chief Officer Wise with about 15. The USS Reno, a 4-stack destroyer, was on a full-power maintenance run, having left Fleet activities in San Francisco. As the captain neared the channel, the fog thickened, causing him to make a momentous decision to go around the islands rather than enter the channel, the shorter but more dangerous route. A very wise and fortuitous decision that would lead to saving many lives. At about 3 p.m., we thought it was a fishing boat at first, but as we dashed by, I saw that it carried too many passengers for that type of craft. Farther out, we passed a second boat, and we knew then that they were in distress. Our speed was so terrific that we were forced to make a long circle of more than 5 miles to slow down before we reached the lifeboats, quoting Captain Barry, commander of the Reno, in the LA Times October 10th edition. Ironically, Lifeboat 1 and Lifeboat 2, with Owens and Rochot in command, were on a course heading west out to sea rather than towards the mainland, due to an erroneous compass setting. They were to thank their lucky stars they were spotted by Captain Barry's destroyer. Lifeboat 3, Chief Officer Wise related, "Soon we encountered 2 spouting whales. At first, neither was close enough to cause any great fear. Then, the one nearest us dived. When he came up spouting and thrashing the water, he was much nearer. He dived again and came up within 39 feet of our frail craft, spouting and beating the waves as if angered by our presence. We were unable to even attempt rowing away, for all our energies were needed to keep the light craft afloat, to keep her headed right toward the enormous waves, each one of which threatened to engulf us. Then the current helped us, for we were borne into the main channel away from the whales. The lifeboat, with 15 aboard, headed east along the south side of San Miguel Island, then through the San Miguel Passage as they entered the Santa Barbara Channel. They spent the night in the open boat, and Sunday morning, after being passed by several ships in the fog, they were spotted, rescued, and carried to San Francisco by the Standard Oil tanker W.S. Miller. In the meantime, the USS Reno, through rough and choppy seas and upset and angry pinnipeds, was able to rescue the remaining 25 passengers who had been on the rocky beach. Through this terrible ordeal, miraculously, all passengers and crew of the Cuba survived, and there were no serious injuries. Captain Holland and 8 other crewmen stayed with the wreck for 6 days and removed most of the ship's cargo, valued in the millions, including mail, silver bullion, and mahogany, to the camp that they had set up on the beach. A salvage vessel arrived. The cargo, Captain Holland, and crew headed for the mainland. What happened over the next few hours is a classic story of drama, intrigue, salvage law, and humor involving Ira Eaton, as chronicled in Diary of a Sea Captain's Wife. Unfortunately, that account will have to wait for another time. The Cuba's bell is on display at the Sexton Museum in Goleta. The Cuba's safe is now in the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum. What was about to happen in just a few hours, about 45 miles to the north, is a disaster unequaled in the United States Navy peacetime history. We leave the island of San Miguel, past Point Conception to Point Honda, to what is often referred to as the Graveyard of the Pacific and the Devil's Jaw. As I studied this image, I was captivated by what I saw, so I coined my own description. Not the Devil's Jaw devouring ship after ship, but the Devil's Hand, fingers stretched, waiting to clutch its next unsuspecting victim. After a summer of fleet exercises in the Puget Sound and Northern California, the U.S. battleships and accompanied destroyers had just concluded a week of dances, parades, and boat races and were warming up to return to their home bases. On the deck of the destroyer, USS Young, 2 officers were chatting idly, awaiting the call for all hands to ready the ships for sea. One seemed worried. "I know it's a mighty red sky, but that's not what's bothering me. referring to the old saying, "Red sky at night, sailors delight. Red sky at morning, sailors take warning." I guess it's the fact that our new Chief Commissary Steward has been absent over Liberty for 2 days. And the truth is, according to Scuttlebutt, he had a hunch that something is going to happen. Something bad. I actually hadn't thought about it until yesterday when I saw 3 or 4 rats trying to get ashore over the mooring lines. Wow, what a portent of the calamity about to come. On 8 September 1923, the ships of the United States Navy's Destroyer Squadron 11 lined up for what was to be a 24-hour shakedown cruise from San Francisco to San Diego. The destroyers, each 314 feet long, 32 feet wide, were fast. They could make 32 knots, and on this voyage would cruise at 20 knots or 23 miles per hour. In the lead and pictured here was the squadron flagship, the USS Delphi. The ships were ordered to maintain a speed of 20 knots, expecting to reach Point Loma in San Diego at the crack of dawn the next morning. Except for the Delphi, radio silence was to be maintained, and only the Delphi was allowed to request RDF, or Radio Direction Finder bearings, a relatively new navigating technique. Dead reckoning was the standard method of navigation by the fleet. Quoting Wikipedia, "Dead reckoning is the process of estimating one's current position based upon a previously determined position or fix, and advancing that position based upon known or estimated speeds over elapsed time and course." A disadvantage of dead reckoning is that since new positions are calculated solely from previous positions, the errors of the process are cumulative, so the error in the position fix grows with time. A single line column was formed behind the Delphi as they steamed south. This chart and those that follow display the makeup of Squadron 11. Captain Edward H. Watson was the chief or commodore of the squadron. He was one of the Navy's most experienced navigators, whose father before him was navigator for Admiral David Farragut in the Civil War. His flagship, the Delphi, captained by Donald Hunter, was in the lead, followed by 3 divisions. Division 33 was commanded by Robert Morris, his flagship, the USS Lee. Division 31, commanded by William Pye, his flagship, the USS Farragut, and Division 32, commanded by Walter Roper, his flagship, the USS Kennedy. Following the Delphi, the Division 33 ships lined up one behind the other. The S.P. Lee, captained by William Toaz, the Young, by Captain William Calhoun, and the Woodbury by Louis P. Davis, and the Nichols by Herbert Roche. Destroyer Division 31 followed. The Farragut, John McLean, the Fuller, Walter Seed, the Percival, Calvin Cobb, the Summers, William Gaddis, and the Chauncey, Richard Booth. The last group, Destroyer Division 32, comprised of the Kennedy, Robert Bell, the Paul Hamilton, Tracy McCauley, the Stoddard, Leslie Bratton, and the Thompson, Thomas Symington. At about 10 a.m., Point Montara Light near Half Moon Bay was passed, and then Pigeon Point Light some 50 miles south of San Francisco. So each of the ship's navigators had an excellent chance to fix their position. As visibility conditions worsened, most of the navigators felt Avo Nuevo Point, halfway between Half Moon Bay and Santa Cruz, would be the last land they would see until reaching Port Arguello Light, some 175 miles ahead. The winds were picking up and the swells increasing, as was customary during early afternoon. The winds and seas were coming from directly west, astern from the destroyers, causing some steering difficulties. 2 years earlier, radio direction finder stations had been established at 4 locations along the California coast, including one at Port Arguello. Like anything new, there were startup bugs, and many older generation seamen had their doubts as to their accuracy. As you recall earlier, Captain Dick Barry of the USS Reno, on a solo speed run, had made a momentous decision which saved many lives. Foregoing the Channel Passage and electing instead to skirt around San Miguel, he rescued 71 survivors of the SS Cuba sinking. This led to the airwaves crackling with urgent messages and created considerable confusion, which led to an argument. William Roper, Commodore of Division 32, called Commodore Watson and requested permission to take his division, consisting of 4 ships, to assist in the Cuba rescue. Deciding that 1 destroyer was sufficient, his request was firmly refused. Some 8 hours later, with the wind and waves continuing to increase and visibility decreasing in fog, the convoy believed they were about an hour away from Point Arguello. Requesting radio bearings was delegated to the squadron flagship in accordance with Navy regulations. Captain Edward Watson and 2 other experienced navigators on board the Delphi had to work largely by the time-honored, if imprecise, technique of dead reckoning. Soundings could not be taken at 20 knots, but they checked their chart work against bearings obtained from the radio direction finding (RDF) station at Port Arguello. Sometimes those messages were intercepted by some ships in the squadron, causing worry that their ships were not making the cruising speed of 20 knots and therefore not as far south as they should be. Others worried because their compass courses had the Delphi steering to eastward. The navigator on the Kennedy, having intercepted messages sent to the Delphi, indicated that the sending station was dead ahead. Not one division commander or ship captain challenged the information received, believing that the Delphi was receiving frequent radio bearings and that information must be better than theirs. One further complicating factor was the effects of the Great Kanto earthquake, magnitude 7.9, which occurred 1 week earlier, causing unusual swells and strong current changes off the coast of California, the effect of which remained for a number of days. By 8:30 p.m., visibility was reduced to less than a mile. The dead reckoning on the plotted chart of the Delphi showed them to be well south of Pont Arguello. Then another radio bearing was received, to which Captain Hunter murmured, "Another impossible bearing." Navigator Blodgett, "The bearings have been off a few degrees, but they have all put us north of the point. How about a sounding, sir?" The captain shrugged and looked at Commodore Watson. "No, not much use. Possibly can't reach bottom. Spoil our engineering run." At 2100 hours, change course to 95 degrees true. Most of the ships were 150 yards and a mere 13 seconds apart. At exactly 2100 hours, the Delphi made her sharp turn, expecting to be entering into the channel just south of San Miguel Island. Moments later, without warning, the flagship was engulfed in heavy pea-soup layer of fog. At 21:05 came a series of violent bumps, followed by the smashing crash of a head-on collision as she slammed into Honda's jaw and stuck fast. A few hundred yards behind, the USS Lee saw the Delphi suddenly stop and then turn sharply to port, but she quickly struck the coast north of the Delphi. Following her, the USS Young had no time to turn before she ripped her hull open on submerged rocks and rapidly turned over on her starboard side. The next two destroyers, the Woodbury and the Nicholas, turned right and left respectively, but also hit the rocks. Steaming behind them, the USS Farragut was able to back away with relatively minor damage. The USS Fuller piled up near the Woodbury. USS Percival and Somers both narrowly evaded the catastrophe, but the USS Chauncey tried to rescue the men clinging to the capsized Young and herself went to ground nearby. The last four destroyers, the Kennedy, Paul Hamilton, Stoddard, and Thompson, successfully turned clear of the coast and were unharmed. In the darkness and fog enveloping the seven stranded ships, several hundred crewmen were suddenly thrown into a battle for survival against crashing waves and a hostile shore. Seconds before, and convinced the Delphi had run aground on San Miguel or one of her reefs, Captain Hunter immediately ordered, "Signal the squadron and keep repeating it. Keep clear of westward and 9 turn, or make a 90-degree turn to the left, hoping to send the trailing ships into the channel and away from San Miguel." He ordered, "All back full," with sirens blasting. The generator died, and all went silent and black. The order was given to abandon ship. Immediately, the Lee entered into the fog into which the Delphi had vanished, and just a moment later spotted the Delphi's lights just before they went out. Captain Toaz commanded, "Stop, stop." At 11 yards a second, that was not going to happen, but the engines slowed her down through nothing short of a miracle. She missed the Delphi by a hair. Huge waves pouring across her deck and battered her constantly. A big chunk of jagged volcanic rock ripped through her side and into the generator, causing all the lights to go out. When the fog cleared, as they clung to anything stationary on the steeply slanted deck, they could see survival was a mere 50 feet away. But with the sea crashing violently about them, it seemed impossible for either a boat or swimmer to take a line without being crushed. Suddenly, the Young rose as if trying to surface like a submarine, and then crashed down. She had run over a submerged pinnacle reef, tearing deep gashes on the starboard side. Seconds later, the Young again surged upward with wind and waves lodging her upon a submerged ledge. With 15 feet of water in the engine room, all went dark as the generator died. With no time to man boats, rafts, or even life preservers, Captain Calhoun determined the best chance for survival was to stick with the ship and not to jump overboard. The men crawled to the port side just before the Young flipped over, with the right side barely 2 feet above the water. Many of the men were barefoot, in skivvies, soaked and cold. They huddled together for warmth and safety, and to protect themselves from getting swept overboard from surf and swells. In the blackness of the night, and having nothing to hold on to, Suddenly a shaft of light, which seemed to have come from heaven, shone upon the pitiful scene. Chief Boatswain's Mate Arthur Peterson noticed a reflection from the glass of one of the portholes. He dove into the sea and vanished, returning with a fire axe in his hand. One by one he smashed the 14 portholes, providing a hold for the shivering sailors. "Sir, I have lost sight of the Delphi, and the lee has sheered out to port, and the Young has stopped," reported Ensign Bushnell from the crow's nest on the Woodbury. The Young's lights were spotted, then she went dark. Knowing the Young was dead ahead and spotting the lee, Captain Davis ordered full right rudder to avoid hitting both ships. She struck and apparently jumped over a rock and then crashed hard into what later became known as Woodbury Rock and today is known as Destroyer Rock. The rock is a jagged, precipitous mini island. 5 of the crew volunteered to make a daredevil leap between the ship and the petrified lava to inspect the rock with its tall stubby spines and spires, edges as sharp as a dagger. As the crew scanned the area with the searchlight, suddenly, there on the surface, they spotted a dark mass. It was the Young on her side, with men hanging on for dear life. Then layers of fog moved in and shrouded the horrific sight. As the Nicholas followed in the wake of the other ships, the Woodbury could be seen about 250 yards ahead, and the Young disappeared as curtains of fog drifted in. The skipper, Captain Roche, ordered an immediate left turn to avoid collision with the Woodbury and the Young. As she did, she crossed the northern rim of the Devil's Jaw. Rocks ripped the starboard propeller from its shaft. The Nicholas drifted and came to a stop on a clump of rocks, and after trying to dislodge itself, the remaining propeller failed. She was listing 30 degrees, so all hands were ordered port side. She was exposed to the constant assault of the thundering surf and surging wind pouring over her listing deck. The USS Farragut, the flagship commanded by William Pye and skippered by John McLean, was the lead destroyer in Division 31. Following her were the Fuller, the Percival, the Somers, and the Chauncey. Sighting searchlights and hearing what he thought were sirens, Lieutenant Hartman told his captain, "I believe it is a collision, sir." The captain later said, "I saw ships steering out of column in every direction." The Farragut now had only 40 yards of open water between her bow and the fantail of the Nicholas. "Full astern, hard right rudder," came the command. As she came to a slow stop and hearing the cries of men calling for help, he thought he saw a whaleboat, but instead it was a huge rock, and he was drifting right at it. "All back emergency," he ordered. The generators, robbed of their steam, shut down. All lights, including the backup lights, went out. The Fuller was just 200 yards behind and closing fast. The oncoming Fuller then struck a submerged rock which cut deep gashes into her sides and bottom. She rapidly lost power, but momentum kept her coming. As the Farragut turned, the Fuller came within inches of the propeller guards and grazed into the Farragut. She struck at midship, leaving a deep dent and carrying away life rails, awnings, stanchions, and stretchers. Captain McLean thought he might be able to back the Farragut out on roughly the same course he came in on, but just as he was making good progress, the jaws took one more bite. She shuddered and was lifted bodily by a great wave and dropped. Another miracle. No serious damage was reported. She backed into deeper, safer waters. The USS Farragut, which had run aground, was the first ship to extricate herself from the Devil's Jaw. she would survive. The deep gash in the Fuller was about 4 feet in diameter. Water was gushing in with the force of a gigantic pressure hose. She was now some 40 feet away from the pinnacles that were above the water. Winds and waves brought the Fuller up on the exposed rock. There, her bow jammed in between two rocks. In a heroic move, machinist mate Frank Moon sized up the situation, found a rope, fastened a lasso, and after a few tries, caught a large stump of rock. Then, after proceeding hand over hand, he surveyed the rock and estimated it could provide a refuge for 20 men. The skipper, Captain Walter Seed, decided the rock was too small and dangerous. Meanwhile, Moon spotted the wounded Woodbury about 100 yards away. The Percival caught a dim glimpse of the ship ahead steering sharply to port with her speed lights showing red. Captain Calvin Cobb immediately rang down both engines. Not liking the situation and being 250 or so yards to the right of the fast-approaching Somers, he decided to reverse engines full speed and hightail it out of there. The Somers and the Chauncey went streaking past her. Captain William Gaddis of the Somers was uneasy with the new course, since it did not quite tally with his dead reckoning, which had them further north and closer to shore. When the frantic command was given by the Delphi to turn 9, he gave instruction not to do so, sensing something was terribly wrong. Seconds later came word, "We will hit the beach if we stay on this course. Stop." Gaddis immediately countermanded, ordering to 1/3 ahead, right rudder. Almost at once, a large breaker suddenly emerged from the fog, signaling that a submerged reef lay 50 feet away. "Reverse engines, full speed," he ordered as the bow struck a hidden ledge. Then, while backing up, she struck another hiding fang of the jaw. Her damage was moderate, but she was able to make it to safer anchorage, joining the Farragut. The Somers was the second destroyer, though grounded, to live to see another day. The Chauncey, skippered by Richard Booth, was engulfed in thick gray fog, but the captain was allowed a brief glimpse ahead of lights both to his right and his left. He also was able to see a ship coming towards them. As he cut his speed, a message was received from the Delphi, warning to keep clear of westward. The Chauncey, using right and left rudder movements, was able to further reduce its forward speed. A sweep of their searchlight revealed a horrific sight. Ships strewn about like toys, and men hanging on to the overturned young. Captain Booth knew there were two things he had to do: get out of there and try to rescue the young's crew. The poor sailors, hanging on for dear life, had enough to deal with without the fear they might be rammed or the propeller's wash might cause the young to slide off the ledge it was resting on. Backing at full speed, he planned to make another try, but fate ruled otherwise. The Chauncey's stern was seized by the outgoing undertow and raked under the port propellers of the young, which cut through the starboard side as if it were cardboard. The ship was dealt repeated knockout blows from a series of breakers, and then a giant wave tossed the destroyer onto a sunken reef. The Kennedy, flagship of Commander Roper of Destroyer Division 32, was skippered by Robert Bell. A radio compass bearing was intercepted, indicating that the Delphi was north of Pont Aguayo and closer to shore. Noticing a sort of bunching up of ships at 2105, the Kennedy slowed and soon after came to a stop, as did the other ships of this division. The Kennedy, now dead in the water and being tossed by relentless waves, felt a bump in the bow. "Holy Moses, we're aground!" shouted Captain Bell as he ordered, "Back full." Taking soundings, they determined they were closer to shore than previously believed. Then a signal was received from the Delphi, "Turn 9." "Disregard that order," Division Commander Roper directed to Captain Bell. Using whistles and megaphone, he ordered the ships in his division to disregard the Delphi's orders and instead directed to turn seaward. Destroyer Division 32 was spared. Only 5 minutes had elapsed since the Delphi tried to send out futile warnings. One by one, 9 ships had steered, follow the leader, towards the hell that awaited them behind the curtain of fog that had hid the rocks of Honda. 7 proud destroyers had gone to their death. 2 more had felt but escaped the fangs of the devil's jaw. For mere minutes, in some instances seconds, whistles blew, sirens screamed, searchlights swung, and blinkers gave their warning. Then, as power ran out, all grew dark and silent. The silence of a graveyard in which the stranded destroyers stood as immobile as potential coffins for almost 800 courageous fighting men praying for a miraculous rescue.